it's difficult to really make headway that way. And I think that's really common in a lot of companies that I've worked with. Big companies, too, have these issues where they're just throwing people in, almost like throwing them in with no life raft, no directions, no life preserver, no swim lessons, and then wonder why they're drowning. Hey everybody, welcome to Finding the Upside. Well, I have an amazing episode in store for you today. I am talking about the biggest mistakes to avoid as a business owner, leader, and CEO. I have curated some of the best tips and some of the things that I've seen that are missteps by leaders, CEOs, and owners. We're talking about how to engage people, how to onboard appropriately, also how to become and embody traits of a great leader, as well as culture and living out your core company values. I hope you enjoy this episode. Take a listen, and I'll see you on the other side. I think the biggest pushback is in engaging people and building and leading the team. I think those are the two that people struggle with the most. And the reason, I think, is because it requires them to reflect on what is deficient in their own skills. It's difficult to really make headway that way. And I think that's really common in a lot of companies that I've worked with. Big companies, too, have these issues where they're just throwing people in, almost like throwing them in with no life raft, no directions, no life preserver, no swim lessons, and then wonder why they're drowning. And that's something that it's not a blame on that person. It's a blame on. It has to come back to, let's assess how to make sure we don't make those mistakes again. I had one recently that I did not vet properly, and the onboarding was probably a little bit shaky. So I myself, even though I teach this, it really requires a full awareness to look at our own efforts and what our own accountability in that is. And that's another trait, is being accountable as a leader, good or bad. Identifying what are the traits, characteristics of a great leader. And I asked them to think about the best leader that they've ever encountered, right? Maybe it was a coach, maybe it was a boss, maybe it was a mentor. A lot of people don't have one that has all the qualities they would like. Kind of if we picked and chose, some of each and put them all together into one, it would be the perfect, ideal boss or mentor or coach. But at least to identify somebody that they can think about and then think about those qualities. What is it? What are those traits or qualities, characteristics that made that person a great leader? And I put them in the seat of the observer on purpose. And the reason why is because it's a lot easier to look at somebody else than look at yourself. So what I do is we go through a discussion where I say, what are the traits? Let's share them. We start to talk about them. We write them up on a whiteboard. And what I do is when they tell me what the trait is, so maybe they say, good communicator. So now I'm going to ask some stupid questions. Why is that important? Obviously, I know why it's important. Right. And I say that to them. But it's really important for you to articulate what that looks like and how that feels when it's there, when that person possesses that, and what happens when it's not. And so I take them through those questions to kind of engage and have them really elaborate on that and articulate what that looks like and illustrate it. And we continue to go through. Sometimes they come up with ones that are bad characteristics not to have, and then we come up with the opposite of that. So ego is one that typically comes up, and we say, yeah, okay, well, so what is it to not have an ego? To be humble, right? To have humility. We go through all of these characteristics. Now I have to tell you that I've done this exercise thousands of times at all different types of companies with all different ages of people and types of industries. And the traits that are on that board, they're always between 25 and 35 traits or characteristics, always the same group. They're always the same. Pretty similar. And so once we get to 25 or 30 or 35, whatever the number is, I kind of step back and I say, okay. And then I say, look at these traits. These are your words. These are the traits and characteristics that you said were important to be a great leader. Now your job is to turn the mirror back on yourself and ask yourself if you possess these qualities. So now I've shifted them from position of observer to now observing themselves and reflecting on themselves. And I give that imagery, I say those words for a reason. Usually the stares in the room are a little blank for a couple minutes, because that's usually a moment where there are some light bulbs going on, going, oh shit. Oh boy. I have some work to do. Now, sometimes they can have validation to say, yeah, I have those qualities, but I need some work in these areas. But then I go a step further. Then I ask them to say, okay, so if you've had some eye-opening here and you say, I'm doing a really good job here, I need some work here. Before you accept that you have the qualities that you say you do, I want you to write them down on a piece of paper. And next to it, I want you to come up with an action or behavior that you've taken or you take routinely that shows and exemplifies that you have that quality. So what I mean is, you can't just say, I'm positive. How? Give me an example of an action or a behavior that shows that. You can't just say, I'm humble. How do you show that you're humble? What behaviors or actions do you take? Give me specific examples. And when I have them go through that, and sometimes I do that on the front end, where I first tell them, okay, take a couple of traits and then assess your leader, right? The one that you said was great. If they didn't have that behavior, were they really a great leader? Because many people can say, I'm humble, I'm a great communicator, I'm honest, I'm trustworthy, I'm accountable. But that's just talk. It can't just be, traits and posters on the wall. There has to be action and behavior. So that is one of the most transformative training activities, exercises that usually helps people kind of see and breaks down that wall, because people are prone to talk when they can talk about other people, but then it's kind of like a switch where then they have to reflect back on themselves. I do believe that you can do this work through remote. It's really having that connectivity and those forums. So what do I mean? I mean those weekly meetings, those weekly touch bases, those different levels of touch points. So if you think about, even I could relate it to customer service. With a customer journey, there's all these different touch points, right? The same with an employee. In order to have somebody be engaged and part of a culture, they need to feel part of a culture. So obviously more challenging if you're not in the same physical location. But one thing I'll point out is, way before COVID, for many, many years, and not everybody wants to believe this, people worked in different locations before. It's not a new thing. 20 years ago, I worked for a Nielsen company. We had people all over the country. Some people worked out of their home because that's where they lived. We didn't have an office in that location. We had that 20 years ago. Some worked in the Chicago office, the Detroit office, some worked overseas. We've had that structure for a long time, but the commitment needs to be there for the communication to have that unity and create those forums, either virtually or occasionally in person, to have people feel connected and feel part of something. And so back to your question of the culture. Having culture, obviously you need to have some principles, some core values, some, whatever you want to call them, okay? And one company that I worked with, which I really loved this, they had hierarchical values. And so their first value was people first. Okay, very simple. People first. They lived that. It wasn't just something that was on the wall. People first. So that meant when they were making a decision, they looked at if it was adhering to those core values. And as I said, they were hierarchical. Am I saying that right? Hierarchical. So people first was number one. Number two was to make the best product in the most cost-efficient way and not to impact the planet. Okay? So that's a loaded one, because you could cut some of the ways that you're making that product, maybe putting some cheaper material in. But if people first is your first value, it would violate that one. So we can't do it. So back to the scenario we're talking about. If people first is your core value, then I need to be concerned about how Jane is going to feel commuting 2 hours into the office. And how is that going to impact her productivity? Just because I want to see her swipe, right? So again, it's really all of those things. What is the structure? And based upon that, how are we making decisions? And we're not just looking at the monetary costs, we're also looking at the morale and the way a person is going to be able to produce. And that's important. And another analogy that's just coming up for me that I think is really pertinent is if you take a coach, right? And a coach that just focuses on skill, right? Conditioning and skill, and forgets about this. You ask any athlete and they will say 95% is the head game. It's all about this. So many coaches miss that, and they don't work on that. It doesn't matter what the skill development is. It doesn't matter what you do and how much conditioning you do. If you don't help them as an athlete, you don't address what's going on up here, it's going to impact the outcome. It's really the same with employees. It really is the same with employees. So here's the thing. Business is set up to not acknowledge that. Really, in general, there's a lot of companies that don't do that, and that's the norm, and that's what's modeled. And that's, I had a mentor one time, and she would say, well, that's corporate America. You signed up for that. You know what it was like. You signed up for that, and it's true. It's kind of it's a little bit of it's a culture, yeah. But I always challenge, how's that working out? If it's working for you, great. But most times, it is contributing to the problem you are experiencing that you are trying to overcome. So again, back to your comment, which I love, it's radical awareness, radical acceptance, and radical accountability, commitment to change it, because you're working against yourself.